with some of the greatest challenges of our times. I am just delighted, and what I'll do is I'll actually introduce all three of the panelists, and then I'll turn to Ambassador Ibrahim Khalin to give some opening comments before we get going. This session is on the record. Everyone, please silence your phones, and you can engage on Twitter by using the hashtag #ACSummit. Ambassador Ibrahim Khalin, his scholarship on the relationship between Turkey, the Middle East, and the West, and in particular, his 2007 book, Islam in the West, is widely known. He's not only an important actor on the political stage and the government stage in Turkey, he's also, over many years already, been a very respected and important intellectual thinker on these issues. He's the official spokesman for Turkish President Erdogan, who we'll see a little bit later on this morning after this panel, and he served the president in a variety of high-level capacities, including as special advisor, ambassador, deputy secretary general. In addition to his role in the Turkish government, Ambassador Khalin is a fellow at the Prince Alawid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in Georgetown University. After his opening comments, he'll join a panel as well with General Jim Jones, chairman of the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center and former chairman of the Atlantic Council. As the commander of U.S. European Command and NATO Supreme Allied Command Europe, General Jones led all military operations for NATO. Later, as National Security Advisor to President Obama, he brought clear vision and steady leadership to America's mission in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and the country's interests elsewhere around the world. General, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the future of NATO and Turkey's role within the alliance, among other issues, when we get into the panel discussion. And then our third panelist, Ambassador Peter Westmacott. We're very proud that he is now a distinguished ambassadorial fellow with the Atlantic Council's Future Europe Initiative. Ambassador Westmacott, Sir Peter, served with distinction as the British ambassador to the U.S. from 2012 to 2016. He's no stranger to Turkey, having served as the British ambassador to Ankara from 2002 to 2006. He also served as the British ambassador to France. Ambassador Khalin, it's my pleasure to turn the floor to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Let me begin by thanking the Atlantic Council for organizing this very successful conference summit, which they've been doing now for a number of years in Turkey. And I'm happy to say, and this is not to flatter you, but this Atlantic Council is really becoming a major international platform in Turkey where issues as diverse as energy, security, stability, strategic issues, etc., are being discussed. So it's really kind of widening its horizon, but also keeping its depth in the economic and energy fields. So congratulations to you and to your team. And we are very happy to see you here in Turkey with all the colleagues and friends here. Let me also congratulate the Council for choosing the title for this panel, where we will address Turkey, the Middle East, and the West. I think it's a very timely topic. It, first of all, forces us to look at these issues from a multidisciplinary point of view. And that's one of the things that I think we're missing in the world today. When we look at the issues from a very narrow point of view, I think we miss out the larger picture. And this is one of the issues that I will try to address in my remarks. One of the things I think that we will have to address when it comes to Islamic Western societies and their relationship, their long relationship, which goes back almost 1,000 years, is the issue of trust or lack thereof. I think our modern age has been described by many markers, including the age of anxiety, the age of ideology, the age of this and that. I think, but one of the markers that we can use, I think, to describe what's happening recently, especially in the world today, is the question of trust or mistrust. There is so much mistrust going on between Islamic and Western societies today, that we have to do something to regain that trust at various levels, at the perceptual level, at the policy level, at the economic level, at the human-to-human relations level. Mistrust obviously is fed by a number of factors, misperceptions, clash of interests, and many other things. But when we look at how different societies, Islamic and Western societies, have experienced modernity, there is something that we need to address there, in the sense that the promise of modernity for rationality, for freedom, for prosperity, and for equality has turned out to be, or to produce different results for different communities and societies around the world. In the 18th, 19th centuries, the belief in the promises of enlightenment, a free and rational society, a prosperous future, fraternity and equality for all people and nations, etc., was something that defined the spirit of the age. But European colonialism in the 19th century, two world wars in the 20th century, and their spillover effects, on the rest of the world, not just on European societies, but non-European societies, on the Middle East, on Africa, on Asian nations, have obviously put into question the very promise of modernity. And the way Islamic and Western societies have lived or experienced modernity and its promises in different ways has also had spillover effects into the modern period. Even today, for example, after almost a century after European colonialism, the legacy of colonialism is still very much out there. If you ask ordinary people, many people will still remember what happened a century ago. In parts of North Africa, in the Middle East, in the Gulf region, in Africa certainly, and in Southeast Asia. So we have to understand this, I think, the larger picture we have to deal with is obviously more than just Eurocentrism. And I want to underline the significance of this point. Eurocentrism, that is looking at the world from a particularly Eurocentric point of view, remains, I think, a problem even today. Even though we may say that, well, the age of colonialism is over, we live in a world of globalization, in a world of multiple perspectives, competition for alternative truths, etc. But still, deep down, I think the legacy of Eurocentrism is still very much there. And my contention is that Eurocentrism hurts Europeans as much as it hurts, other nations. And by Eurocentrism, I do not simply mean, ruling the world or seeing the world from a purely political point of view in a Eurocentric perspective. What I mean is, at the same time, looking at the world, culture, society, economics, human relations, aesthetics, and things like that from a particularly Eurocentric point of view. Now, having said that, obviously, Muslim societies have to deal with their own ethnocentric perspectives. I think it's easy to criticize Western societies' Eurocentrism, but we have to see the problems in Muslim societies, how they fail to address some of these issues in a way that will add to the growth of global culture and civilization, as Muslim societies did for more than 1,000 years. Today, for example, when we look at some of the hot spots in the Muslim world, whether it's in North Africa or in the Middle East, those regions from Iraq to Syria, from Libya to Tunisia and other places, have produced some of the greatest minds in culture, science, education, technology, arts, over the last 1,000 years. Today, unfortunately, much of this world is equated with terrorism, with poverty, with bad management, with corruption and things like that. Obviously, Muslim societies themselves have to do something to change this course of events. And they have to do this in a way that will preserve their traditions, that they will keep them anchored in their own tradition, but at the same time with an open horizon perspective to the world. So in other words, neither going for a kind of inward-looking ethnocentrism where they lose touch with the rest of the world, but nor, I think, falling for some sort of a liberal utopia where, no identities, no borders, no culture, no memories matter. I think those things, identities and memories, collective memories, do matter, and they shape the way we look at the world. It's just a matter of how we manage those perceptions, those identities, self-perceptions, rather than ignoring them or acting as if they don't matter. I think they do matter, and we have to take them serious. It's just a question of how to manage the relationship between the self and the other, between us and the rest of the world. So this is my contribution as far as the conceptual side of my remarks is concerned. As an academic, I can go on for another 2 hours. I enjoy talking about this subject, but I know we have a lot of policymakers here, so let me turn to some current issues as well. And hopefully some of these conceptual remarks will help us understand some of the pressing geopolitical issues that we are faced today. First of all, let me say that the issue of, I think, misperception plays right into everything practically we do in our business as government officials, as policymakers, as commentators in our daily lives. A recent example is the referendum that we held on April 16 in Turkey. We had a very long campaign where both sides, both yes-sayers and no-sayers, held vibrant campaigns, and they expressed their views freely. And at the end, people went to the polls and they voted. And we believe that Turkey took a historic turn with this vote, and we will end the period of weak governments, coalition governments, or the possibility of those governments with this new presidential system. And we also believe that the new system introduces a good system of checks and balances. For the first time in our history, the parliament will have the authority and the mandate or the possibility of going after a president if they deem that the president has violated the law. That is, the impeachment process has been made possible with the new system. The current system, as you know, the parliament doesn't have that power, but the new system introduces that. I don't want to go over all the aspects of the new system, but I think what we have seen over the last couple of months, especially in some of the European media, was that there was so much prejudice, so much kind of pre-thinking about some of these issues that a very one-sided coverage of the campaign was made available. And in Europe, we faced a number of problems, where some European governments, unfortunately, prevented some of our ministers and politicians from meeting our Turkish expatriates in Europe to explain their point of view. When in fact, in the past, we always had this situation where Turkish politicians from different political parties will go to Europe and meet with the Turkish communities in Europe, where we have about 5 million of them. And we never had any problem. For the first time, this year, we had this very strange situation, which led to this tense relationship and tensions between Turkey and certain European countries. After the referendum, unfortunately, we have also seen that some of the observers presented rather a kind of very one-sided, at times a distorted picture of what happened here. The reason I'm giving you this as examples is the following. Sometimes maybe we fail to explain what happened in Turkey adequately to international audiences, but sometimes the international media and other commentators, opinion leaders, I think fail to understand the magnitude of what happened in Turkey. Again, to give you an example, what happened here on July 15 last year, the coup attempt, was something that we've never seen in our history. We had 3 major coups in the past and one what was called a postmodern or soft coup, but we never had seen anything like what happened on July 15. And the trauma that the Turkish society experienced that night and in the days that followed probably did not register well with the international audiences. Therefore, the precautions and the actions that we had to take after the coup maybe were not understood properly, why we had to take these actions. We still get these questions like, how come that you have fired, more than 100,000 people? Why do you still keep firing people, continuing these prosecutions, et cetera, et cetera? I will need another 2 hours to explain, obviously, what this FETÖ terrorist organization is, because I know really there is no other organization that I can refer to in the history of Europe, for example. I mean, some people have said, well, the Illuminati can be compared, or Lodge 204 in Italy, but they really never reached the extent, the depth that FETÖ has reached in Turkey. And when you fail to understand this part of it, and then people get confused, obviously, about how an organization like that can infiltrate state institutions for 30, 40 years and do at the end a coup attempt like this. But I think we have to pay really more attention to some of these issues so that we understand that Turkey had to take these actions against these coup plotters after the coup. But it's not only that. Turkey is also fighting against PKK terrorism, and we are also fighting against Daesh or ISIS along our border. And in our fight against the PKK, our Western allies have been helpful at times, but there are times when, again, the question of perception or lack of trust has hindered our ways, has made our job rather difficult, and sometimes has caused tensions between allies. The PKK is a terrorist organization, as it is recognized by the United States, by the European Union. And sometimes we are criticized for giving this fight against the PKK terrorism. Again, the issue of proportionality, etc., is raised. But again, I think sometimes it's because people maybe miss out on the fact that what PKK is doing, against the Kurdish people, let alone against the Turkish state and Turkish civilians, is also a crime. It's also a war crime. It's a crime against humanity because they're fighting against their own people. Everybody knows what PKK has been doing in terms of killing any Kurdish opposition groups, within the Kurdish communities, etc. We are also fighting against Daesh. Obviously, it's it's part of the international fight against Daesh. But sometimes we have difficulty understanding why Turkey's fight against Daesh is not recognized or acknowledged as it should be. We started the Euphrates Shield operation with our own means and capabilities last year in August. And honestly, we had very little support from the international coalition and the community, in that fight. What we did there was to clear more than 2,000 square kilometer area from the Daesh terrorists. And we had hoped that we will have received more support on our fight against Daesh, but it didn't come. So I think it raises some questions about, again, this issue of perception or misperception and other issues. Now, I want to conclude by reiterating my earlier point, and that is that Islamic and Western societies do not have to be on a collusion course. But I know there are certain camps that advocate for it. The clash of civilizations argument or camp. The rising tide of extremism, populism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia that we see in certain European countries. I think these things are issues of concern to all of us because they color people's perceptions, they shape people's attitudes towards one another. But we have to accept the fact that we live in a world of growing interdependencies. No country, no nation can claim to be an island and immune from the impact of globalization. It's a question of how we accept this fact and deal with the consequences in a world in which we become more and more interdependent, in a world in which identities, collective memories, self-perceptions do matter. And as we go forward, I think as globalization takes different shapes and forms in different parts of the world, we have to address these issues of trust and do more as political leaders, as opinion leaders, as religious leaders, to build trust, lines of communications between different societies, so that we avoid the mistakes of the past and hopefully build a better future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Khalil. While you're getting seated, and thank you then, and that was a good, very good setup for this discussion. We're very lucky on this panel to have someone who has been the National Security Advisor to a President of the United States, therefore has talked to the President to a President at historic times. We have someone who's done very much the same sort of thing with the British Prime Minister, and obviously with the Turkish President. So we have people who know how to speak to influential leaders at moments like this. So General Jones, I may turn the conversation in a little bit of a different way, having heard the opening comments, but also knowing your past jobs and understanding that President Erdogan is about to go to Washington. You've just experienced the first strikes on Syria through the Tomahawk attacks in answer to the chemical attack. There seems to be new sanctions that the President has agreed. There's a relatively new National Security Advisor, McMaster. It looks as though things are starting to move in terms of U.S. policy or actions toward the Middle East, if not yet a full strategy. President Erdogan is coming to town. And you've just experienced this week a strike on yeah, exactly. And so YPG, PKK positions, depending on out of whose voice they're coming through. What is your advice? What is your advice to the President of the United States? What's at stake for this meeting? And maybe a little bit what's at stake from both sides for this meeting coming up in the White House?
Well, I think first, thank you very much for your remarks. I think the issue of perceptions and misperceptions and trust and mistrust really have to be taken head on, and not just at the government level, but also in our public sector. We have to better explain ourselves to our publics, and it's different challenges in different countries, but we have a multiplicity of common threats that demand common solutions in a very, very difficult and fast-moving and challenging world. I am optimistic that the personal relationship at the presidential level seems to be off to a good start. They've had at least two personal phone calls that I know of, and in the meeting coming in the near future, it bodes. I think it bodes very well. One of the things that this topic that we're discussing is underscored by, in my opinion, is the essentiality of Turkey. On both sides of the issue, whether it's the West or whether it's the East, and it's very fortuitous that we're having this discussion in Istanbul. The essentiality of the Turkish voice and the Turkish opinion is without question critical. One of my observations of the last 8 years, 2 of which I served as National Security Advisor, was the bad things happen when you stop talking to each other. And in this world of globalized, rapid movement on major issues, the dialogue is the immediate dialogue in the aftermath of things that can lead to misperceptions and lead to trust, lack of trust, is very important, because if it gets played out in the press, which is right on top of the situation, but if we aren't talking to each other almost faster than the media can react to it, then you run the risk of misperceptions and mistrust, and that escalates rather rapidly. There are common issues that we have to rebuild. I think that in the aftermath of the Obama administration, that the perception that the U.S. was disengaging or less interested in the Middle East, less interested in NATO, less interested in the UN and some of the governing bodies, and whether it's true or not, the perception was that we would say things at the presidential level and not do them. And I think the one historical footnote that kind of best typifies how those things happen is the red line on Syria a few years ago. That, regardless of whether it's fair or not, that set a mindset, not only in this region, but really in the rest of the world, about where the United States was really going to go. And it's been interesting to watch in the aftermath of the strike in Syria, and the missile strike on the airbase, the sudden turnaround in terms of how the U.S. is perceived. Now, this is not a strategic aha moment, but it is a tactical moment that at least caused people to say, okay, this is a new game in town, and the U.S. seems to be back to doing what it says it's going to do. If it says, if you say you're going to do something at a head of state level and you don't do it, there ought to be a pretty good reason that everybody can buy into, because otherwise you take a step backwards. So on issues like Turkey's borders, this is something that Turkey, at least in our opinion, we talked about this yesterday with Steve Hadley and the ambassador, this is a valid issue. These are big issues that affect us all, and 15 or 20 years ago, we would come together on these issues. In 1991, we had a big issue on Turkey's borders with the Kurdish problem and Saddam Hussein threatening to use chemical weapons against his own people, which a refrain that we were hearing recently, and a coalition, an international coalition of some effectiveness came together and solved that problem with Turkey. Where is the outrage? Where is the common solution today? And because there is not one that is really effective, that mistrust and the misperception multiply. So whether we're talking about refugees, which is a big security issue, and where our friends and allies, particularly a NATO member, deserves a lot better than I think that we've done, or energy issues, or economic issues and governance and rule of law. These are things that we should all be working on together. The world is moving too fast for the institutions that we created in the 20th century, whether it's the UN, the EU, the African Union, the GCC, our own governmental structures in Washington, do not seem to be able to keep up with the pace of activities. And that, on the serious issues, that has to be replaced by something. And it has to be replaced by speed of communication to avoid the lack of trust and to avoid, in my view, the misperceptions. So I think it's great that we're here in Istanbul. I think this is a really good topic. I think it's a 21st century issue. And I really deeply believe that these meetings that we have, particularly not only with think tanks, but also among governmental institutions, to accelerate the way we deal with these major events is absolutely fundamentally critical to solving the problems that were so well addressed on the issues of trust and misperceptions. Thank you.
Thank you, General Jones. Sir Peter, you can certainly pick up on anything you've heard from from Abraham Killen or General Jones. But I also wonder, as the West European on the panel, you've watched European-Turkish relations for a long time. On a scale of 1 being the best and 10 being the worst, where are we on that scale right now, and why? And what kind of problems does that cause, since we're talking about Turkey, the West, and the Middle East? What does that cause in terms of problems in solving the overall picture?
Thank you, Fred, for the nice, easy question. Let me just make a couple of comments in response to what Ambassador Cullen was saying and a little bit what Jim was saying. Tremendously helpful framing, I think, of the discussion from Ibrahim Cullen. I would just like to say this, that I think Turkey is, in a number of respects we need to remember, a very special case. It is an overwhelmingly Muslim country which is finding its own solutions to its own issues, and it's got borders with countries as complicated, as difficult as Iran and Iraq and Syria and Russia. But it's also got borders with European Union member states like Greece and Bulgaria, and there's Armenia, and there's other issues all around the border of Turkey. And for more than 100 years, Turkey has been regarded not only as that hugely important country in this part of the world, but as also one of the founder members of the Council of Europe, of NATO, and is a candidate member for a number of years for membership of the European Union. So in a way, it is a test case for the way in which secular democracy, rule of law, freedom of expression and so on, can function in this part of the world. And I remember years ago when I was ambassador, hearing from some of my Turkish ministerial friends saying, the rest of the Muslim world is watching us like hawks. And they're watching you, Europeans, because they feel that if you lot can't come to terms with us as Turkey, with a democratic constitution based on a secular society, then what hope is there for the rest of them to establish a proper relationship with the European Union? And I remember having a very enlightening conversation with President Erdogan just before he became Prime Minister, shows how old I am. And he explained to me how comfortable he was with his Muslim faith and implementing a secular constitution of this country. So in a way, yes, Dr. Cullen of course is right that the extraordinary creativity of Muslim societies is a unique part of their heritage and has to inform the way in which so many of those countries are wrestling with their problems today. But Turkey, in a sense, is almost, I won't say judged to, but shall we say held to a higher standard because it is both a European country as well as such a critical strategic partner in this part of the world. So I just wanted to give that little bit of context to what Dr. Cullen was saying. Second thing I want to say is on the question of trust, couldn't agree more. I think there's been an awful lot of talking past each other, some unnecessary name-calling on all sides. I don't need to give chapter and verse, but I think we all know what that's about. I think it's extremely important that President Erdogan is going to Washington very soon. I think that's going to be an important relationship. It was Winston Churchill whose last words to the government that he left when he finally left British politics in 1955 was, "Never be separated from the Americans." And for those of you who might think this is sometimes difficult, he also said, you can always rely on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. So, don't worry, it's going to be fine, in other words. So I think this is a very important part of that relationship. But we were also asked to think a little bit about Turkey, the West, Middle East scope for working together. And I just want to touch on that briefly. When I started out as ambassador here, we spent many months working as NATO partners on Afghanistan. And Turkey agreed to take a leadership role in running ISAF, the international security force in Afghanistan after 9/11. Extraordinarily important contribution that Turkey made to the alliance and to regional stability. Turkey has done some important work more recently in Libya. Actually, Turkish businesses are hugely important in the development of Libya, and there may well be roles that Turkey can play there, because that is a country which there was military intervention from Western countries without a follow-on plan, and Libya has got all sorts of difficulties as a result of that. Turkey may be able to play a role there. I don't need to talk here about how important a partner Turkey is in trying to bring a solution to the ghastly mess of Syria. Turkey is there, Turkey is next door, Turkey is a critical partner for the United States in terms of dealing with ISIL and is engaged in the fight against Daesh and ISIL itself, and of course is also trying to play its part in finding a political settlement for the post-Assad world of Syria. It has shown, I think, extraordinary imagination in addressing what happened in Iraq. Initially, there was deep resistance in Turkey to the idea of a Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq. But Turkey came to terms with that pretty quickly. Turkish business is doing very, very well in the KRG. And I think that there is a model there and a wisdom from Turkey's dealings with that aspect of the Kurdish problem, which I'd like to think could be brought to dealing with the issue that Ibrahim Kalin touched on, which of course is hugely sensitive here, about the way in which the YPG, as a kind of preferred partner in dealing with ISIL in northern Syria, is also indistinguishable from the terrorist group PKK. And then there's the issue of Turkey's own very large Kurdish community, where President Erdogan earlier on was, I think, one of the most enlightened statesmen we've had in Turkey in terms of the initiatives that he took in addressing issues of education and language and broadcasting and so on in the southeast. There's something in that whole area of addressing the multiplicity of Kurdish questions where Turkey could hold the key and could even use its very important relationships with another complicated neighbor, Iran, in order to try to move that forward in the right direction. There are many other areas in the region where Turkey could be an indispensable partner for all of us. Much of it is based on establishing trust, which has become a bit frayed. And I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, Fred. It's always dangerous to answer difficult questions like that. But without giving a number to it, I think I would say that the relationship between Turkey and both Europe, which has got messy over a number of issues, including the ones that Dr. Cullen talked about, but also with the United States, it's not in great shape. The trust isn't really there. Some of it is about the Kurdish question in northern Syria. Some of it is about the consequences of the failed coup and the Fethullah Gulen issue and what's going to be done about that. And some of it is about perceptions of the way in which Turkey has responded to the coup. All this is complex stuff, but I think open communication, no surprises, total honesty, and continuing to talk to each other. It's worked pretty well in the past. We must keep it going in the future.
Thank you, Sir Peter. Ibrahim Kalin, I wonder if you could, you obviously don't want to upstage your boss, President Erdogan, I understand that. But on the other hand, I wonder if you could give us a bit of an idea of what is success in the trip to Washington, D.C. Is this more of a get-to-know-you session along the lines of the Xi Jinping visit to Mar-a-Lago? Or is there going to be more of an expectation of some deliverables? The reason I ask this is when we were here with the task force earlier this year, led by General Jones and Steve Hadley, who's in the front row with us, and we met leaders of the country, we really got the feeling that there was an expectation of movement on the YPG PKK issue, and there was an expectation of movement on Fethullah Gulen of some sort or another from this administration as well, or any host of other issues. So will there be a desire for some concrete outcomes, or will it be enough for this trip for a get-to-know-you session?
Thanks, first of all, to General Jones and Peter for their comments. In response to your question, there are two issues that have come up as problematic in recent history of U.S.-Turkish relations. One is the PYD-YPG issue. The other one is the FETA issue. All other issues, if you look at them, from fighting against terrorism to energy cooperation, Iraq, Syria, and many other issues, in fact, we see eye to eye. But on those two issues, there is this legacy of the Obama administration. The idea of supporting PYD, YPG in the fight against Daesh as the most credible force, etc., has been, kind of designed, defended, implemented by the Obama administration, which we believe had really strain Turkish-U.S. relations at various levels. And we had this conversation for the last 2 years or so. So one expectation is obviously to see some change with the Trump administration on this issue. We made some concrete, specific proposals for the Raqqa operation, for the fight against Daesh in Syria, as well as in Iraq and other places. And we do hope that we will make progress, in the trip to Washington, because we've been talking to our counterparts at various levels, mill to mill, myself to my counterparts, and foreign minister and others, and we are hoping that the meeting in the White House on the 16th, the two presidents will address and provide a roadmap for all of us so that we put this issue behind us. On the FETÖ issue, again, of course, the expectation is that the U.S. administration take a very clear stance on this, and of course, within the rule of law, we understand, we fully respect the judicial process, but we also believe that there are things that the U.S. administration can do, and this man is running this criminal empire from the United States. And it's not just one man, but his team, his people, in their hundreds, are using the American system, American laws, and American taxpayers' money through charter schools and others to attack our country, to run the smear campaigns against us, against our president. And I think this does not really go well with the idea of a strong alliance and model partnership between Turkey and the United States. So we are hoping that we will make progress on this issue also. On all other issues, of course, we will continue to discuss. For example, one issue, which is, I know, one of the themes that you have as a priority for this council, is the bilateral economic relations between Turkey and the United States. I think compared to the size of our economies, what we have is just peanuts. It's not even $20 billion. It's less than 20. I think it was like 17, $18 billion last year. And we really have to do something about this. And when President Obama came to power, I remember one of the dimensions of the model partnership definition was that the economic dimension was going to be very strong. And we were going to reach a target of 30, 40, and eventually $50, $60 billion trade. It never happened. We have to find a way, to make this happen. And with President Trump coming from the business background, and I'm hoping that we will make progress on that issue, and the two leaders will look at this very seriously and give instructions to related agencies so that we upscale the economic cooperation. On long-term issues, I think Turkey and the United States have a lot of work to do, and we can, in fact, coordinate and help each other to deal with emerging global issues, such as, for example, fighting against terrorism and violent extremism. I think one of the lessons we have learned, one of the painful lessons we have learned from the experience with this Daesh terrorism over the last 3-4 years is that we cannot defeat this terrorist menace without winning the minds and hearts of the people on the ground. What we have seen in Mosul, for example, the reason why the city of Mosul fell so easily, so quickly to Daesh terrorists, and now has been under their occupation for almost 3 years now, is that because the people in Mosul felt isolated, felt alienated, they felt helpless. Thanks to the policies of the Maliki-era Iraqi government, they felt like they're being marginalized, they're being treated as less than human by the Iraqi government, and so on and so forth. And that kind of brings up all this issue of sectarian tensions and what we're doing or what we're not doing to prevent any further escalation in sectarian tensions, and this ties into Iran and many other issues. But if we are going to fight violent extremism, terrorism, and the terrorist groups that use the name of Islam, we really have to develop new strategies to deal with this issue. First of all, we have to stop using this term Islamic terrorism, Islamic radicalism and things like that, which hurt Muslim feelings, which do not help in any way our common fight against terrorism, which, thirdly, play right into the hands of the extremists who feel vindicated by such terms, saying that, oh, you see, we are being recognized as as Islamic so-and-so, we have to reject this terminology. We never use Christian terrorism or Jewish terrorism or Hindu terrorism, even though there are acts of terrorism committed by people who happen to have Christian names, Jewish names, or who claim to do these things in the name of Christianity or Judaism. I can give you, a dozen examples. I don't want to take up the time. You all know the examples from recent history. We have to stop using these terminologies because it's not just a matter of using words. It's really a matter of reaching out to the hearts and minds of the people, the kind of trust that we have to build, as we've been discussing here. On Turkey-EU relations, if you allow me,
yes.
Because there was a comment in Peter's remarks on Turkey-EU relations. I think it's an important relationship. We want to maintain a good relationship with EU, and we want to keep the EU membership as a strategic goal. But I have to tell you, in very brief fashion, it takes two to tango. It cannot be a one-way street. If you're going to talk about partnership based on equality, respect, mutual interest, and trust, it has to be a two-way street. It cannot be just the Europeans telling Turkey what to do all the time, while the Europeans themselves first contradict and at times violate their own principles of democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech. Secondly, on failing to make good on their promises in the agreements that we have. To give you an example, if we really want to make progress, if the Europeans really want to make progress in their relationship with Turkey, again, I will come back to the two issues of the PKK and FETÖ. Why are the European nations allowing these terrorist groups to function, to recruit, to collect money in their midst against the very important ally, which is Turkey for them? I really have a difficult time understanding why, our European friends allow and give the space to all these almost hundreds of anti-Turkey groups having a free ride in European capitals with flags of PKK, with flags showing signs or posters telling to kill Erdogan and things like that. I'm trying to understand, what's happening here. I describe it as an eclipse of reason in Europe in many ways. And if our European friends really want to repair this relationship and nourish a healthy relationship with Turkey, really they have to do something about the presence of these terrorist groups, illegal groups in Europe, which use Europe as a kind of launching pad against Turkey all the time, through media, through recruitment of people, collecting money, and so on and so forth. And lastly, Turkey-Middle East relations. I said very briefly in my remarks that the Muslim world has to have a moment of reckoning for its own failures. I think it's too easy to get into a blame game where we put the blame everything on others so that we feel good about ourselves. I think we should stop this. Muslim communities have to address their own problems by going back to their own roots and sources. And I believe the rich Islamic intellectual scholarly tradition has a lot to offer to many of our issues today, from the issue of pluralism and multiculturalism to sectarian relations and relations with the rest of the world, education, science and technology, creative thinking, and all of these issues. We really have a very rich tradition of which we are proud, but our current present situation obviously creates a lot of tensions, mental fragmentation today. Therefore, I urge the Muslim communities also to take responsibility for the state in which they find themselves today.
Ambassador Khalil, thank you for that. We only have 5 or 6 minutes left. I'm afraid we're probably not going to get to questions, but I know that Jim Jones wants to respond. Within your response, Ibrahim Khalil, Ambassador Khalil talked about what might be expected from the U.S. side at this meeting in Washington, D.C. Perhaps in your comments you could also deal with what might be expected from Turkey, from the U.S. side at this sort of meeting?
Well, thank you, Fred. I really think it's quite simple. I think what Turkey and maybe the rest of the alliance, particularly the NATO alliance, the European community, and the Arab world and others expect from the U.S. is leadership, and they expect commitment, and I think we have to repair those bridges. If NATO 28-country alliance is important, it has to be because the U.S. manages to communicate to the 27 other countries that it is important and we want it to succeed. Turkey can do an awful lot by also recommitting to the alliance in the sense of leadership in the Black Sea region. I think it would be a great idea for a summit to be held in Turkey, on a NATO summit to be held here. More participation.
Which President Erdogan has suggested.
Right.
Right.
And more participation by Turkey, which has the largest army in Europe by some degree of measure in NATO exercises. We have to do things to revitalize these relationships, and they have to be demonstrable and they have to be seen by our publics. We can be doing things right now to talk about what is going to happen the day after Mosul is completely liberated, to the point that hearts and minds are important. I think they're very important. I don't see too many solutions in the world today that have military solutions only. If we're willing to engage to change behavior, we have to have a more comprehensive plan that involves a coalition of people, of like-minded people. Arab states, Turkey, Europeans, United States. Where is that coalition to talk about what happens after Mosul is liberated? How are you going to address the economic condition of the people of that particular region? For that matter, the idea of a formula that captures security, economic development, and governance and rule of law are really the three main pillars of engagement. And for some reason, we have drifted over the last 15 or 20 years. We've forgotten the lessons of World War II, where we defeated Japan and Germany. But what did we do right afterwards? We reached out the hand of friendship and reconstruction in a massive way that produced two countries that are remarkably influential on the globe today. And you don't have to do it on that level every time. This isn't a world war, but in a sense, there are some issues that demand more than just a military solution. And those are the things that wealthy countries like ours can bring to the table, in addition to security, but energy security, food security, water security. And that's a now problem in the Middle East. It's tomorrow's problem where Africa is concerned. So I just would plead that we really make our approach more holistic than just pushing the military button and walking away from it before the job is even a third done, which we've done in Iraq, and I think we've done it in Afghanistan, and we certainly have done it in Libya, and we should stop this.
Sir Peter, you have the final word. For 2 minutes or less. You can solve the Turkish-EU situation. Let me just tell all of you in the audience, if you want to look at a report that really captures a lot of what General Jones was just talking about, look at the AtlanticCouncil.org website, look at the Middle East Strategy Task Force report with the co-chairs of Steve Hadley and Madeleine Albright, and it takes a good swipe at a more original and more comprehensive agreement that wouldn't fall into the traps of the past. Sir Peter, final word.
Thank you, Fred. I just would like to make 2 points. One, to pick up on Dr. Collins' plea for a different use of terminology in terms of Islamic terrorism. I very much understand what he's saying. That's one of the reasons why over the years in the UK, and I think it's probably true of President Obama beforehand, we tended to use a term of radical Islamism. In other words, you can't deny the fact, I'm afraid, that a lot of these people creating outrages are doing it in the name of Islam. But it's equally terribly important that we do not brand everybody who is a Muslim with some sort of responsibility for what they're doing. So we've used the term radical Islamism rather than calling them Islamic terrorists or extremists or whatever it happens to be, because part of the solution has to be to reach out to the Muslim communities in all of our different countries. Much of the terrorism that we've got in the UK, for example, and France has got, it's homegrown. It doesn't come from any other country. And these are problems that we've got with our own Muslim communities. So we have to devise terminology which is both honest, but also does not pigeonhole and unfairly tarnish law-abiding, honest, sincere Muslims with some sort of collective responsibility for the outrages perpetrated by a small number of individuals. But I do take your point. I think it needs to be handled. The second point, European Union, Turkey, two-way street. I think there's a number of reasons why Turkey has a legitimate sense of grievance about Europe. One of them goes back to the moment when finally Turkey accepted the Annan Plan on Cyprus. Turkish Cypriots voted in referendum in favor. Greek Cypriots voted against it after their own president had actually signed off on the agreement, and a divided Cyprus became an EU member state. And I think that created a lot of distrust, actually, here about the goodwill of the European Union in terms of its negotiating integrity. That's a bit of history. I think that there is an issue about the way in which Turkey plays host to 3 million refugees and hasn't actually been given the recognition or the financial support that the European Union has promised. We're trying in lots of different ways to provide humanitarian assistance, but I think there is more. On the PKK issue, this is all about the way in which our laws are applied. PKK is a proscribed terrorist organization, no question about that. But just as we have found in the past in the UK, when we had terrorism in Northern Ireland, there was a group called NORAID in the United States that went around raising money supposedly for humanitarian victims of British injustice. It was fundraising for terrorism. And we found it extraordinarily difficult to draw the distinction between what claimed to be legitimate fundraising for humanitarian purposes and what was actually support for terrorism. And the only way you can do that in all of our countries is to apply the rule of law. And where people break the law, where they transgress, clearly set out rules about what is and isn't legitimate, then we've got to throw the book at them. But where they operate within the law, it is difficult. We're conscious of the issue. We do recognize PKK as terrorists. I think that is the case throughout the European Union. But it is very difficult where there is a grey line, a fuzzy line, if you like, between what is legal and what isn't. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very, very much. Before I ask you to join me in thanking the panelists, let me give some housekeeping. The next session, very important session, begins at 10:45 and takes place next door at Fuji 2. It will feature President Erdogan, Minister of Energy Al-Bayrak, and Steve Hadley introducing. If you're planning to attend the session, ensure you're seated by 10:30 a.m., so that really gives you 10 minutes to get there and sit down. Wear your credentials at all times, and if you have any questions with the agenda, you'll see the screens around. Ambassador Colleen, General Jones, Ambassador Westmacott, thank you so much for such a fascinating panel.